Thank you very much for joining us today at the Zero Carbon Future Pavilion. We're going to discuss the decarbonization of Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe. For those who don't know us, I'm Alice Aviron from Cleaner Task Force. We're an international, non-traditional NGO that is really looking at how to cut emission as fast as possible and what kind of technology we need and what kind of policy we need to reach that result as fast as possible. We've been active in Europe for several years, but we want to focus more and more on the different regions of Europe and the different options that will be needed to make sure that we can reach our decarbonization targets. We had an event earlier this week about the decarbonization of Europe, where we mentioned the importance of having different decarbonization options depending on the country's specificity, and that's what we really want to explore more today. Europe as a whole did commit to decarbonize by 2050, but each country will have a different decarbonization pathway. And for that, we need to make sure that all the technology needed will be on the table so that all the industry, all the country, all the region will have the tool necessary to decarbonize. So we're joined today by an amazing panel. Thanks a lot all for joining. So one of them is going to join us later. Michel Kurtika, who was president in 2018, will join us normally in a few minutes. I would like to welcome the panel, starting with Milan Zbaha, Director General for the Directorate of Air Pollution and Climate Change in Slovakia. Thank you very much for joining us today. From another country perspective, we also have Michel Danelka, who is from the Department of Energy and Climate in the Ministry of Environment of Czechia. From more of a southern perspective, we have Riccardo De Laurenti, that is joining us from Italy and is the head of the decarbonization unit at the National Institute for Environmental Protection and Research in Italy, and that has been working a lot on the air pollution inventories and trajectories projection. And finally, we also have Lina from Bellona, who is the senior manager for EU policies and has been working on different parts of Europe, specifically on the technology required, including, for example, carbon capture and storage. Thank you all for joining us. We will start by discussing with Reka Suliok, who could not be here today, but pre-record some of her comments. She is the head of decarbonization at the European Institute, and we'll discuss the different question of why do we need diverse technology and diversification of the decarbonization pathway. Hopefully it will work. It was working earlier. Bear with us a few minutes. So maybe while they're
crucial structural differences across European economies when we talk about any decarbonization. So when it comes to Eastern European perspective on this, I think the key most important thing is that despite the fact that these countries were able to reduce their emissions from the levels of from 1990, there are very, very important structural dependencies on carbon. So when we take a look at the carbon content of their GDPs, so to what extent the economic growth has come from emissions, there's still the huge problem that Eastern European countries have a much higher ratio. It basically means that they are still not at the stage where they would be able to decouple their economic growth from using natural resources. And because of this, they are highly vulnerable to decarbonization because their economic growth prospects would suffer unless we are able to manage the transition well. And also, I think one another key important thing would be the institutional readiness here. So these countries have less of an experience of actually planning for climate and inducing some sort of long-termism in their policymaking. And I think one another key aspect maybe to consider here is also the adaptive capabilities of these economies. So in Eastern Europe, one of the other problem is with the economic growth model and the structural um, issues with the economy is that despite like a very strong economic performance over the last decade, their progress in actually moving towards research and development activities has been rather slow. So what it means is that their economies are still like pretty much dependent on the lower value added manufacturing jobs, and to a lesser extent, they invested into research and development capabilities that would allow them for like decarbonization innovation. So I think like these are the key most important factors.
There is a second question that you contribute to.
So
can you hear me? Yes, can you please answer the second question about like what kind of technology option need to be on the table to allow for like the different countries to decarbonize on time? So if it doesn't work, that's fine. And I will start with you, Milan, because you have the mic, so you know. So what are the key elements of the Slovakian decarbonization strategy? What kind of technology are you looking at, and what kind of priority do you want to focus on?
Yes, well, I would thank you for invitation. First of all, I would start, and good afternoon, everybody. And I would also follow to the previous presentation when we were talking about Eastern Europe has still structural dependencies on the carbon. Yes, it is true, and one of the reasons why it doesn't look so nice lately is that we have much higher share of industry in Eastern Europe, at least in our country, and this is connected with a really difficult task to decarbonize the economy when the economy is really heavily based on industry. And now I'm coming to situation of Slovakia, where is a really nice example. We have 47% coming of our GHG emissions coming from industry. Can you imagine? Half of our emissions are coming from industry. And now in this situation, there is still technologically most of the industry you cannot decarbonize it completely. Anyway, we are doing it. So I would start with the situation that Slovakia, the highest share of emissions are coming from industry, whether it's industrial or energy side or part of the industry. And only then the third sector is transport, which is another situation in other more, we use the term more industrialized, but let's put it in this way, Western European countries. They have the high share of emissions, for example, from transport. And we have really minute emissions coming from agriculture. So basically, if you want to decarbonize, this is also in our strategy, you have to concentrate mostly on the industrial part. And especially in Slovakia, it's so visible because our electricity production is from the most of the part decarbonized, or is going to be decarbonized in the very near future. Already now we have 80% of our electricity production carbon neutral, or not emitting any CO2 directly, because it's our electricity mix mostly is coming from nuclear with combination with hydro and biomass. There's let's simplify it. And we do have some lignite power plant which is going to be decommissioned within 1 year. And by 2024, 2025, we should completely remove coal from our energy mix. I'm not talking about the individual households, because you might find some traces, but I would say most from our economy would be completely remove coal by 2024, 2025. So in this situation, as you see, the electricity production from point of view of GHGs is not such a big issue. And therefore, in our strategy, we concentrate mostly on the industry or ETS sector, which is industry plus heating sector, from where is coming the emission. Since we have 30-40% of our heating sector coming from big central distinct heating plants, and this is quite challenging to decarbonize them as well. And so this sector should be the priority for decarbonization, and then the household sector or the building sector with the insulation or refurbishment. This is the other big part of our sector or economy which we are trying to decarbonize. And it's also in our strategy, it's in our policies. And then only the third is a transport, where we should concentrate from our projections and also from our modeling itself. We should concentrate mostly in the later part of this decade on decarbonization of the transport. Also due to the specificities that we have 5 million people with on the country which is 3 times the size of Belgium, and we have small cities. Half of the population is basically living in outside of the cities. So the density of the population is not that great or very well built for big deployment of electrification in transport so far with current technologies. So this is also other specificities. So as you see, these variables are giving us also constraints and also completely showed us the pathway how to decarbonize in Slovakia. Too much industry, not that heavy or densely populated areas, then almost completely decarbonized electricity sector and the problematic heating sector. But I will then maybe talk more about some of the challenges. So this is just a short introduction.
Thank you very much. And indeed, like, decarbonization in the industry have been a challenge in almost every country of Europe. We have quite a lot of targets and incentivize with the carbon price in the ETS, but now we kind of need to work this industry on the path of decarbonization, and they definitely will need some kind of attention and support if they want to actually be able to meet the decarbonization timeline and to avoid paying a carbon price within like the ETS system. Turning maybe to another country, Michelle, can I ask you to share us what are the Czech climate priority at the moment and how they have been evolving in the last couple of years?
Thanks for having me in the panel. Reacting to the previous speaker, in our case, the situation is a little bit different. Since for us the clear priority is the decarbonization of the energy sector, and only in the second place the industry sector, because we still have about 40% of our GHG emissions coming directly from electricity and heat generation, where we are among these countries which are still to a large extent dependent on coal. So this is clearly the biggest challenge. It's also opportunity for us, at least until 2030. We have a goal of phasing out our coal power plants until 2033, to which our government has committed, and despite some setbacks due to the current energy crisis and that some coal power plants may be operating a little bit longer than previously expected, we are planning to stick to this plan and take out these power plants by 2033. For this, we have set up quite a lot of a whole landscape of various programs and measures. The most important is probably the modernization fund, using the revenues from the EU ETS, from the energy allowances, and only the modernization fund as such is expected to bring down our emissions by about 18 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And this will be done by investments in decarbonizing the heat sector, for energy efficiency in buildings and industry, and for a large-scale deployment of renewable sources of energy. Of course, we are also among these countries who still count also nuclear energy as a part of the decarbonized energy mix, but we really cannot count on a new nuclear energy realistically before 2040, so it will not help us with our 2030 targets. And even then, after 2040, it will be mostly just to replace the capacity which is expected to be decommissioned by about 2045. So the share of nuclear energy will mostly increase only due to lowering the share of other sources of energy. And maybe also to mention CCS. So far, we do not have any pilot project in the Czech Republic, but we have an ongoing project in southern Moravia, where we are expecting that all the preparatory documentation will be available by the end of 2024, and soon after that we will start with realization of this project. So in most of the scenarios for future development in the Czech Republic, we are counting to some extent on CCS, but only after 2030. There will be, we are quite sure there will be no CCS before 2030. So this is maybe for the opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Oh, and Michel Kurtika is able to join us. Thank you so much for managing to find us first, very literally, and then to join us. And maybe I can directly turn to you. Like, you were the president of the COP a couple of years ago. What do you see as like the progress that have been achieved so far, and what do you see that we still need to work on currently at the COP?
Thank you very much. So first of all, I'm very glad to be here, and thank you for your invitation. Thank you for this continuity in our discussions. And I was COP24 president, presiding the same kind of event, as you can see here in Sharm, in Katowice, a very different environment. Katowice at the heart of Silesia, one of the most industrialized regions in the world, and certainly in Poland. 4 million people within a 1-hour drive, working mainly in the mining, heavy industry, and not surprisingly with enormous air quality problems. And this is why this COP in Katowice was very well welcomed by Polish population and by Silesia inhabitants, because they said, okay, there is hope, there is light at the end of the tunnel, we can change our economy. And the main leitmotif which emerged out of Katowice was just transition. So that we need to involve people in the change. And I think that this is the most important element that we can see all around also in this COP. Just transition, time for implementation, and new challenges. And what are the new challenges? Because you asked me about that. The world in 2018 was much more easy to manage and to handle world. It was not yet a world which is right now entering into a phase of fragmentation. This is the main challenge ahead of COP in Sharm el-Sheikh and next year COP in United Arab Emirates. How out of this fragmented world where coalitions are extremely difficult to build, find a path not only to satisfy selfish interests of egoist elites of this or that country, rivalry between great powers, rising regional powers, by how to not forget about the fact that our health, our planet, the air that we are breathing, the emissions that we are emitting are absolutely key to our survival.
Maybe, Lina, you can keep the micro. So you've been working, Lina, on like several projects on CCS in different parts of Europe. Can you tell us more about Bologna's work in Eastern and Central Europe, specifically on carbon capture and storage?
Yeah, thank you. So, of course, Bologna, recognizing that climate change is a global problem, we actually established offices in Brussels after the Norwegian referendum in the 90s, where Norway rejected EU membership. And tongue-in-cheek, we usually say that Norway said no, but Bologna said yes. Because we saw that the EU is a driving force for battling climate change. And we think that this is something in general that we need to acknowledge, that this is a common problem. But at the same time, there are differentiated issues and problems on the ground in many different regions and countries in the world. And this is why we have established or are part of a project called CCS for CEE, which very specifically work to identify in the Central and Eastern Europe what is the potential for CCS, what is the need for CCS. And here what we are doing is that we are connecting different stakeholders together, and we are trying to find out, in combination with actual experiences on the ground, what systemic changes in the EU and also at the national level can help to enable decarbonization, in particular of industry. So currently we have had several events and also stakeholder meetings. And we also had a report that was just published a few days ago that actually outlines also how different countries can cooperate together, but also feed in specifically into the EU system to try to make sure that the specific needs of the region are met. Because I think it's important to remember here when we are talking about pathways to decarbonization that part of this responsibility is definitely on regions. It is on, for example, in the EU, different member states to make the necessary investments. But it is also a crucial importance that the EU has a holistic approach when setting up this systematic pathways to decarbonization. Because right now we have centralized these projects very much in Northern and Western Europe, and we cannot afford to forget that this is a just transition, and for that we also need to make sure that we take all of Europe into account. So this is some of the things that we are working on in that space currently.
Thank you very much, and definitely a very interesting report that you published recently. So maybe, Riccardo, I can turn to you for like more of a southern perspective, and you can tell us more about what Italy has been doing so far and what kind of policy has been working in Italy to address the different challenges.
Okay. So Italy, the main sector in Italy where we should reduce emission and mitigation policies, especially in 2050, are transport and heating, residential building, heating of building. Because, as you know, Italy is an industrial country, but in the 90s and in the last 20 years, some sectors, we lost some sector, industrial sector, go abroad in other close countries. So the main challenge is to reduce emission in that sector, transport and residential. And for that regard, the industry, we of course we have steel, iron and steel, and cement production, and these two sectors are those where up to now, if we think to 2050, there are not yet clear processes or clear technologies that could result in net emission equal to zero. Carbon capture and storage is something ongoing to be studied in depth. There are two big projects in Italy, one bought from Eni, that is the most petrochemical industry, and they started in 2001 related to the carbon capture and storage and use, another one and in association with the cement production plant. Both these two projects start in 2019, but are still not really ongoing. And what was your question? Coming back to your question, because I lost
so I was asking, like, what has been Italy been doing so far that has been working well in terms of policy to support the decarbonization process?
Of course, in Italy we are, as other European countries, we have developed a national energy and climate national energy plan to reach the project in 2050, and also a long-term strategy that both documentation available and the national communication that we will, national official communication to UNFCCC that will submit by December, are also reported the list of the different policies in all the sector. And the main challenges for our countries could be how to cover the gap from the ideal result of these policies and the real operability of these measures. For example, in the transport, in the building sector, as you know, the characteristic historical urban structure of our cities does not allow easy renovation of building. And the same it's difficult also to think to a network, the net of electric recharge for road transport in the historical city. So it's something that potentially we think that is possible in the future. All vehicles will be electric or hydrogen, but where these vehicles in the historical city will recharge their battery. So there are some gaps that probably our government should take in account now to produce real estimation of and evaluation of the potential mitigation effect of these policy measures.
Thank you. Indeed, transport is quite the challenging part. So going back to you, Milan, you were mentioning earlier that Slovakia was also facing some kind of challenge. Can you tell us more about the challenge you're confronted to in your decarbonization process?
Well, so as I mentioned, of course, even if you start with the industry, you still don't have technologies in many of the industrial sectors, but we're still counting that we are starting with quite heavy transformation of the industry, but we will get there. Sooner or later, there will be some new technologies, even including CCS or CCU on higher scales than they are using now. But the electricity sector, as I mentioned, this is more or less on the good pathway to be decarbonized almost completely. Of course, we will still use auxiliary services, and we will use in the short future based on natural gas, basis and auxiliary services. But so far, the most challenging sector besides transport, that I will mention more about transport, is a residential sector, especially these, as I mentioned, these central district heating plants. And they're heavily dependent on the natural gas. And in general, maybe I should have mentioned it before in my first intervention, that Slovakia has the second best developed infrastructure for natural gas in Europe after Netherlands. So you see this is connected with industry, but also with the heating sector, our heavily dependence on the natural gas. And even if we put everything into biomethane production in Slovakia, we couldn't, substitute this huge amount of the consumption of natural gas with biomethane, more than 10% of the annual consumption. It's hugely also in industry, hugely in residential sectors. So these are big challenges in the heating and industrial sector, also from the point of view of the natural gas and its substitution. Now we in this sector, especially in the residential heating sector, we are going to count more on the renewable energy. This is actually our focus in this sector. So renewable energy in the heating sector would be something where we want to invest heavily in the coming years. But I still have plenty of the challenges I don't have to mention. Maybe which everybody has to face, because the central district heating plants are developed all over Europe, and sometimes it's very difficult to find a proper technology how to substitute it for natural gas. Besides heating sector, as I was going, we have a problem, quite big problem with transport, which is constantly growing, and emissions from transport are quite difficult to, with current technologies, quite difficult to substantially lower in Slovakia, as I mentioned, due to the low density of population, due to the small cities. We still have, even in capital, lives 1/10 of a population of the whole country. As you see, there is another big concentration of inhabitants in big towns. We have smaller towns all across the country, not big agglomerations. So it's and the commutation between these towns is quite heavy, and the distance is quite long. So it's not a really good starting point for big or very popular deployment of the electric vehicles or electric fleet. This is also reflected in our quite low penetration of this new form of transport. Also, we had subsidies and some schemes for support of electrification in Slovakia. So this is very challenging, we have to say, in transport. The other challenge, which is quite difficult now lately, also with this energy crisis, so visible, is use of biomass. As I mentioned, from renewable energy we are using quite a lot of biomass, because we are heavily forested country with use of wood, not just for industry but also for heating sector and production of energy. And the challenging part is to sustainably in the future using of biomass in the larger scales, because if you're substituting, for example, the fossil fuels in heating and mostly heating, not the electricity production, for biomass, you have the problem with the supplies of the good sustainable biomass. The best would be locally produced. And now with this current crisis, it's a problem with it's an open market. The prices went skyrocketing, and we export quite big amount of biomass now to neighboring countries as well. So it would be challenging to keep up with the production of the sustainable biomass at home, especially with the decarbonization going on, and the consumption of biomass as a project should increase. And it would be very difficult to keep up with the pressure on the sustainability of the production of biomass. Then, in general, but I think this is in most of the countries, is especially not very good or favorable environment for a large deployment of renewable energy sources. Especially, we don't have any shore for offshore winds. We are the effectivity of the using of solar is also not as high, since we are very forested and hilly country. So it's not like plains where you have plenty of the free space for deployment of the solar. And as I mentioned, that either in the heating sector or also in the electricity, it's also not a convenient or to use a small renewable energy source as a source of electricity. So these are also challenges we are facing. What we have a good maybe asset is geothermal energy. This is where we should, or we are planning to consider, and here we have a quite big administrative burdens or administrative hurdles, which we are trying to overcome now in the legislative process back in Slovakia. So this is the challenge which is more or less domestic, also connected with some EU legislations, but we are now trying to focus our energy to solve this issue and fasten the process so we can deploy geothermal energy on a bigger scale. This is actually our, I would say, biggest potential on the renewable energy we have in Slovakia currently. So if I come up with something else, I will maybe mention it later.
Yeah, that's indeed a renewable technology that is often overlooked, but that has quite a lot of potential. And as you mentioned, like the crisis in Europe has been like having a massive impact on the way we are like designing our climate policy at the moment and adjusting them to the current situation. And maybe I can turn to you, Michal, and ask you, because like you mentioned the modernization fund, where do you see would be the help needed coming from the EU level to help the member state decarbonize? And how do you see the different member states coordinating with each other to support their own decarbonization process?
Yes, thank you for the question. Modernization part is indeed a part of quite divergent landscape of various programs coming from the EU, and actually we are now facing the challenge of using all the money which is coming now to us from the different sources as efficiently and quickly as possible, because it's the biggest opportunity to transform our energy and industry quickly, to start our pathway towards carbon neutrality. Actually, according to our calculations, all these sources coming from the EU and these opportunities could cover a large part of the financial gap which we have for the investments. Of course, not all of it, but for some of our scenarios for 2030, we see that these new EU funds could cover most of our needs for the transformation, at least until 2030. Then, of course, there will be much higher costs for the rest of the decarbonization until 2050. Yes, from these various programs coming from the EU, we have some quite good experiences. The only one with which we have some issues is the innovation fund, because as far as I know, so far no projects from our region were awarded in this program. So there are no large-scale innovation projects like for CCS coming into our region. So we would like to this to be changed in the near future. Regarding the cooperation with other countries, of course, indeed we have many similarities with other countries in the region, starting with the structure of economy. Then also we have similar natural conditions and let's say general state of development, including the state of energy efficiency, which is still to a large extent lacking in many sectors. So there is a big opportunity for increased cooperation. For example, now we are planning for some regional consultation of our updated national energy and climate program plan, and we are hoping that we will also have to have the time to consult with our neighboring countries on the other upcoming strategies, such as the update of climate protection policy and the state energy policy.
Thank you very much. Then maybe I can turn to you, Michel Coty. I have a double question for you. So you mentioned the just transition. What kind of measure do you think we need to make sure that we leave no country behind, but also like no part of the population and no industry behind? And then looking at the current energy crisis, how do you think Poland can like combine climate action and energy security action in the next year?
Thank you very much. Thank you again. My approach to just transition, so what just transition means, because that's a very general wording, everybody is talking about just transition, but if I ask you what does it mean, probably many people will have difficulties to answer. So, you know, if we say there is a future in 2050 which will be powered differently, so there will be no mining, no electricity generated from fossil fuels, no combustion engines, no gas fire plant, etc. It means that, first of all, we don't have anything to heat our houses. We don't have the fuel to power trains and cars and planes to come to a COP. That was a joke. And then we have a lot of problems because our civilization was built on availability of energy. So the main challenge is to find an alternative. And here we have an abundance of new solutions: renewable energy, solar, wind, nuclear, I believe a necessary renaissance in nuclear, electric mobility, local energy. We need to localize much more things that we did previously. But going from this to that, it's a transition. How to organize this transition in a manner which leaves nobody behind. What does it mean, leaves nobody behind? Nobody is left without ability to function normally, and jobs are preserved. So you need to create different industries. And this is how the subject was perceived in Poland. And so when I was Minister of Climate, first ever Minister of Climate in Poland, I said, okay, so let's move to technologies which have not yet been that much popular, because this is where opportunity lies. So this is how Poland made a big step in terms of electric buses. In 2017, Polish industry of electric buses was exporting 10% of buses within European Union. 1 year ago, it was every second bus, so 48% of buses within European Union were exported from Poland. And so this is an example of how a country can diversify its economy. And of course, it was a very big effort, because we provided a lot of money for cities. And then cities fueled the demand for industry. And then we had an excellent industry. So, you know, this just transition is about building new industries, fueling them at the beginning, and then letting them go. The same goes for solar. Solar this year will be second biggest industry of solar in Europe is in Poland. And it's only 38, 40 months that this lasts. So you can do it in a very short lapse of time. Now we have more than 1,200,000 rooftop PVs on Polish houses. And we have 4 million individual houses. So 1 in every 4 houses already is equipped with a PV. And that's a big sector, employment, etc. So already now, for example, in Silesia that I mentioned in the beginning, there is more people employed in renewable sector than in mining. There is more people employed in IT sector than in energy sector. So you can organize, but it will not happen overnight. So the main message and the main lesson learned from transition of Poland in the 90s, when Poland became again a free country, industrial production dropped dramatically by 25%, and lots of mines, lots of companies were closed. But then you have a desert. Then it's extremely difficult to come back and to bring new industries. So you need to organize it. So that's the answer to the first question. For the second, I will be more brief, I promise. Because war in Ukraine presented a very good rationale for decarbonization in Poland. We don't want to be dependent on Russian gas, oil, and coal. If yes, we need to go for zero emission sources. So this is why last week Poland decided to choose 2 subcontractors for its nuclear industries. First ever Polish nuclear power plants will be built with Americans and with Koreans. So it's happening.
Thank you. Maybe Lina, you can tell us more about what was mentioned on preserving jobs when we making sure we decarbonize our industry, but that we don't desindustrialize, and what kind of technology can be used to make sure that that happens. And also, you were present at the CCUS forum a couple of days ago. Can you tell us more how you can make sure that this kind of technology is not limited to Northern Europe, but it's used to decarbonize the different parts of Europe?
Yeah, thank you. So we do know that, and I appreciate all the mentions also of the just transition, and I think that is something that we are speaking about to a greater extent, and I think that is it's very important. I think it also relates to the fact that if we are to be successful, the green transition needs to have support, and for that to materialize, it also needs to have a very clear basis in job retention, job creation. And this, of course, in industry, CCS is incredibly important. In general, we also need to have this lens of job creation on, but it's not always that CCS, of course, is the solution across different aspects. But I do think that when we are talking about job creation in particular, and this is something that we also spoke about at the CCUS forum, where the EU is trying to highlight the need for CCUS in Europe in particular. We really need to look at kind of the curves of jobs that we need to retain or green or even create to be able, for the society that we want in 2050. And every year that we are postponing any action or postponing investment decision, this curve is growing steeper and steeper and steeper. And I think that this is a real concern, and I think that when we are looking across Europe, it's important to recognize the differences in this curve across different countries. And for this, this is also why the EU has focusing so much on this, because it really is an issue also of cohesion. And as you mentioned, there's several funding mechanisms now that are enabling different paths of decarbonization, also aligned with job creation. But I think that we also need to look beyond kind of just a financial handout, even though that is incredibly important also for development of infrastructure when it comes, for example, to CCS and also in the future enabling negative emissions. We also need to look at risk reduction as a general. So this means, for example, reducing administrative burdens, accelerating permitting processes, and it also means issues of public acceptance, because in particular when it comes to CCS, we know that this is an issue. And this is something we were not able to tackle, at least not comprehensively, at the CCUS forum in Oslo at the end of October. But we do see that it is needed. And I think that this jobs aspect and highlighting to a greater extent exactly how many jobs could be retained, how many new jobs could be created, is key to making sure that this transition and also CCS maybe gets a different narrative surrounding how it is potentially being implemented. Because right now, my experience is that it has a bit of an image problem. I think that also relates to the history and the momentum that we saw 10 years ago, which has now, of course, emerged with more focus on industry. And I think, and also for, of course, with industry, that's specifically emissions that we cannot decarbonize in any other way. I think that is really what we need to keep on pushing, and we need to make sure that the funding that is made available and also the mechanisms for risk reduction is also very firmly focused on this, in parallel, of course, to job creation in general in the decarbonization efforts. I'm not sure if that was the answer to your question. I forgot it a bit along the way.
You did answer the question. Thanks, Lina. So maybe turning back to you, Ricardo, can you tell us more about the technology that can be used to decarbonize and why we should also look at the whole supply chain when we're looking at decarbonization?
Yes, as you know, Italy is not a producer of primary energy sources, so we are typically importer. Our production could increase. Is the plan of this new government to increase the production of energy, of gas and oil, but it will cover at maximum 15% of the energy demand of Italy. So we are an importer country, and we, as you know, we depend from Russia up to now for gas and oil because of the low cost. And this is not nice to say, but this war could be an incentive to decarbonization, to reduce the dependence by other countries of energy. And what we lack now is to develop, especially for the production of renewable sources as photovoltaic, to develop a complete supply chain, industrial supply chain. Of course, it will we will depend anyway from the primary sources as lithium or rare earths that are not in our territory or is very small, limited amount. But this is challenging for Italy because for example, for electric production electric vehicle, we are second in Europe in the production of the components for the electric vehicles. But because of the manager of our national company some years ago say that electric vehicles are no future, we did not develop the complete chain. So this is limiting also the develop of the industry and also the improvement in the sense in Italy. So in Italy now we have only 8% of new vehicle plug-in or hybrid or plug-in or electric. While in other countries, European countries, we are in average 20–30% of new vehicles. So we are very late on this. And this is our main challenge. I mean.
Thank you. You can take it. Thank you very much. Maybe I'm checking the time. Like as a last question, can you all tell us what do you think should be the priority of your country and of the EU if you want to make sure that we decarbonize on time and also that we are addressing the current energy crisis?
Yep. It's very clear. Also this energy crisis, this war showed us that on the one hand it's very difficult to winning off from the natural gas, fossil fuel when they are cheap. So the higher the fossil fuels. But on the other hand, the way how to decarbonize most of these sectors is electrification. So the priority of the EU should be to provide cheaper electricity in order to decarbonize all the sectors, as many as possible, especially also in industry we have high consumption, but also in households and buildings, which the only way how to decarbonize on the smaller scales is locally produced electricity or by electrification or use of other renewable sources. So this would be the priority number one. And basically then all other processes are connected to this priority or the drive through the cheaper electricity, which would help decarbonize most of the sectors. When you go into detail, basically we always end up that the only, when I put it simply, the only easier way to substitute fossil fuels are with electricity unless you have other technologies. Because even in hydrogen production, it's in the end about the electricity as well, or the cheaper form of electricity, which end up in the production of hydrogen, because this is a other pathway for decarbonization of transport, which I mentioned is very problematic in Slovakia, and in the end is about the electrification after all. So to put it simply.
Thank you. So Michal, when you're looking at where the EU could help best, what do you think they should put on the top of their priority in the next legislation that they're developing or implementing to support the decarbonization of the different countries? And what makes you kind of optimistic when you look at the different things happening in your country?
Well, maybe I would start with the second part of the question. What makes me quite optimistic is how the people are reacting to the current energy crisis, and with the rising prices, we see a big resurgence of the interest of people in increasing energy efficiency, in insulating their homes, and in installing, for example, photovoltaics, but also heat pumps and other sources of green energy. So this makes me quite optimistic, and we see similar reaction also in the industry, but of course the cycles are much longer, so we will really see what will happen next. But yes, I think it is quite important to even more stick to the principle energy efficiency first, and then I would also agree with Milan from Slovakia that the electrification is path to go forward. So we also need to have enough cheap energy for powering our decarbonized economies.
Thank you. Maybe Lina, going to you. So when we're looking at one of the challenges to really deploy the technology, finance tends to be a struggle. How do you think we can best use finance to support the deployment of key technology?
Yeah, I think that one thing we need to acknowledge is that we currently have persisting market failures in our economic system, many of them deriving from the failure to price emissions. So of course we do not have an incentive to reduce them. We have tried to bridge that gap in the EU with the carbon price, but the price signal is still too weak and also volatile in nature. So I think the role of finance is to, we want to mobilize additional finance, be it public or private. But to do that, we need to acknowledge the risks that are also present. And here I think governments can come in and reduce some of these risks, maybe by taking first losses, maybe by other kinds of structures where you go in and set floors when it comes to carbon pricing mechanisms. But I do think it is important to have an active participation and cooperation with the private markets as well to try to incentivize their participation. But it will not be enough. It will also need to be specific payouts from governments into, in particular, infrastructure. This is crucial, and we see this is something that is one of the main aspects causing delay currently in our efforts. But I think that here there really is need for having a holistic, systematic kind of approach when thinking, especially infrastructure. And I think this is, when we look at different regions in Europe as well, to make sure that we are getting the most bang for our buck, and that countries can be enabled to work much more together, also on regional aspects across countries, to kind of reach the necessary stages.
Thank you. Then last question for you, Michal. So how do you think the EU could best support the diversification of strategy to decarbonize depending on the country? How can we integrate it both as strong direction to decarbonize from the EU, and at the same time supporting the different technology that the different country could choose to use?
Well, I think that we are right now having a kind of a revolution in energy system from centralized global big sources to localized, decentralized, smaller sources. And everything which supports this decentralization, this localization of energy will be welcome. And I agree completely with you that we need a lot of efforts in terms of unlocking different problems, permitting, access to finance, but also preferences for local systems and local technologies. So when we are talking about biogas, biomethane, small PV, small wind, storage of energy, not only electrical energy, but also heat or cold, geothermal energy, everything which allows to work on the local systems is right now to be boosted, because otherwise we will not make it.
Thank you to all the speakers. We are now coming to the end of the event. It was really interesting to hear the different kind of technology that you mentioned, going from renewable, of course, but also carbon capture and storage, nuclear, geothermals. We will indeed need all this technology if we want to have a shot to meet our decarbonization targets. It was also very relevant to remind us all that we need to look at the energy and industry, but also heating and transport and all these hard-to-abate sector that we are currently facing. And thanks a lot, all of you, to join us today to this discussion, and we hope we will continue this discussion later on. Thank you.